In an unpredictable world, you can't simply wait for change to happen. We created McKinsey Live for leaders like you. Our global experts break down the need to know on the issues that matter most to decision makers and to society. We'll introduce you to leading research, new and transformational ideas, and practical knowledge and strategies, all to empower the changemakers of today, enabling you to step forward boldly, tackle real challenges, and drive change with clarity and purpose. We're helping you take control so you can drive the conversation, so you can lead fearlessly while leaving no one behind, so you can take the reins to create and accelerate growth, so you can build resilience for the future. Together, we can push towards the opportunities of our era. Let's get started now.
Hello and welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahilly, McKinsey's editorial director, and your host for today's event on COP30, the annual UN Climate Summit that took place a couple of weeks ago in Brazil. Most of us have a broad stroke sense of what happened at COP given media coverage of this year's event, but today we aim to take you a little more behind the scenes on what leaders are really thinking about the state of the progress we've made, and realistically, what next steps might look like as we continue to try to advance the global energy transition. Joining me today are two of McKinsey's leading experts on the changing energy landscape. Sanjay Kalavar is a senior partner based in Houston and serves as global co-leader of our sustainability work. Sanjay advises leading energy investors and operators on decarbonization, growth strategy, and scaling new climate technologies, helping organizations improve operations and manage risks. And Mekhala Krishnan is based in Boston, and she is a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is our business and economics research arm. She leads research on sustainable and inclusive growth, focusing on physical climate risks, climate adaptation, and the net zero transition. Mekhala is a frequent speaker on these topics at global conferences and in the media, and her work is regularly cited in leading business publications. Sanjay and Mekhala, welcome to McKinsey Live, and thanks so much for being together with us today.
Thanks for having us, Lucia.
Thank you, Lucia. Great to be here.
So both of you were on the ground at COP, a super interesting location this year in the Amazon rainforest, casting a spotlight on deforestation and the importance of forest ecosystems and biodiversity to climate health. And many seem to hope that this year's summit would reinvigorate a focus on implementation a decade out from the Paris Agreement. Mekhala, let's start with you. You're a veteran of previous COPs. What was the mood at COP30 and what stood out for you about this year's gathering?
Great. Thanks, Lucia, for the question. And I'm really happy that you actually started by saying we're not going to talk about the formal outcomes, because I'm sure many of the listeners have already read a lot about that, everything from tripling adaptation finance to the tropical forest finance facility, et cetera. There's a lot that's been written about it. But I want to talk a little bit about what we observed on the ground. And to start with actually what you said, which is it was a COP that was very much grounded in nature's reality. Belém, which was the location of COP30, was right on the doorstep of the Amazon. And that, I think, was really important for delegates because it really offered a moment for folks to step back and understand why we do the work that we do. And really reflect on progress to date, learn from each other, and plan the way forward. So I think it offered just a really terrific grounding for the work that everyone was doing and the dialogues that were happening on the ground. My second reflection really echoed actually in research that we had put out in the lead up to COP. Was this actually a sense that there is forward momentum that's happening? Yes, it's uneven, but it is moving in a forward direction. So we had done work in the lead up to COP that looked at the physical deployment of technologies that we need for the transition. And what we found with that work was that about 15% of all the technologies that we would need to have deployed on the ground, everything from the amount of solar power assets to the number of EVs on the road, about 15% of those technologies that we would need in place for by 2050 to meet Paris Agreement goals are already in place. So one could look at that number and say we're at very early stages. One could also look at that number and say we've made progress relative to work we had done a few years ago, where a few percentage points advanced in terms of deployment. Yes, it's uneven. We've seen some sectors like the power sector, like mobility, like critical minerals make progress. Other sectors like industrial decarb still in its early stages, things like the deployment of hydrogen or carbon capture technology still in its early stages. But it is overall forward momentum. And that was very much echoed by the conversations on the ground, just this sense that we are making progress and there is a forward direction of travel. I think the other thing related then that we really experienced in conversations was this sense of cautious optimism and a bias to action. I think this was very much a COP that was not about commitments. It was about turning climate commitments into climate action. And that was echoed in conversations that were focused on everything from how do we accelerate permitting timelines to how do we debottleneck the build out of supply chains, to what are big innovation bets that we want to make for the future, to thinking about widening the aperture of technologies. This is now not just about solar power, but also thinking about the role of nuclear, thinking about the role of geothermal, thinking about the role of carbon capture. And so just a widening aperture on the technology appetite. And then also, interestingly, how to capture what others may see as headwinds, things like demand from data centers and AI build out, and actually use these other forces happening in the world more as tailwinds to accelerate progress. And so I just want to close by saying that overall, while it may seem from the headlines that companies didn't show up, that not a lot was achieved, if you actually start to peel the onion, to dig under that a little bit, we actually felt like companies did show up. Not everyone was in Belém. A lot of companies were in Sao Paulo in the lead up to conversations in Belém, but companies were on the ground. There were very real conversations about how to make progress. And in my mind, the conversations were headed in exactly the right direction for companies, how to not just drive progress on the sustainability agenda, but doing that while keeping other broader objectives of affordability, security, competitiveness in mind. And I think that focus will help make this not just a sustainable agenda, but a durable one.
Okay, so that's a relief. Some good news there. Sanjay, what about you? What felt top of mind for leaders and what resonated most with you out of the various discussions you had at COP?
Well, Mekla brought up a couple different things about there is progress being made, but it's differential progress. There's a bias to action, and what's going to be durable in terms of driving sustainability over the long run. And one thing that I noticed that really struck me was that the transition is different in different regions. And a few years ago, we might have all talked about the energy transition, about sustainability, and said, look, there's one way to do this. I mean, if we really simplify it, it's about decarbonizing the power stack, meaning we have as much renewable power as possible. We phase out the use of coal. We phase out the use of liquid fossil fuels. So we decarbonize the power stack, and then we electrify everything, meaning trade out gas heat for heat pumps, trade out internal combustion engine vehicles for electric vehicles, and we decarbonize everything we can through, again, the power stack and then electrifying everything. And I think what we've come to realize as we've seen the energy transition move differently in different parts of the world is that plan, that idea, that overall thread works really well in some geographies and less well in others. So where does it work well? Well, it works really well in places like India and China, where they don't have plentiful liquid fuels. They do have coal, and they have industrializing economies that need overall energy growth. And so how do you get that energy growth? Well, one fast way to do this that also is really pro-climate is to drive renewables. So install as much new renewables as you can, increase the deployment of renewables. And in China and India, that's really worked very well. That also displaces coal, so it's great from a sustainability point of view. And then you got to do the electrify everything point of view. And especially in China, look at the growth of EVs, that's gone very well. And then in China also, what they've been able to do is they've been able to take that leadership in the deployment of renewables and the growth in EVs and build industrial complexes around that. So it fits with the industrial growth goals of the country as well, to be able to build the supply chains for those technologies and to build them on a global basis and really be a leader globally in doing that. So that's worked really well in some regions. Now let's take where does it work less well, or where is there perhaps an alternative way to do it? And I think there's still a question about this, but we're seeing it. And I think the place where you see it the most right now, most notably, is the US, but it's true for many fossil-rich economies. So where there is a lot of oil and gas already, there is infrastructure that has been built over the past 100 years to use that oil and gas. And it just begs the question of, is there another way to decarbonize? And what we're starting to see right now in the US is more emphasis on carbon capture, more emphasis on lower emission fuels, but still emitting, more emphasis on technologies that lend themselves to a fossil-rich economy because of the skills that were built in those fossil-rich economies. So geothermal could be one of them. Hydrogen, to some extent, could be another one. But you're seeing some real movement there. And this is to Mekla's point that there's a bias to action. So people aren't waiting around to see what, where the single logic is to drive the energy transition globally, but rather they're saying, like, this works here. So let's do this here. And I think the big question that it brings up is, can these different paths work? They may be able to work. So like in the US today, we've got lots of energy growth from AI. When we can add renewables, we are doing that. But we also realize that we need affordable and reliable power to power the AI-fueled growth. And so that's a lot of gas-fired electric power plants that get built. And so will it work to have carbon capture added to that, to use more low-emission fuels? And is that going to put us on a path to decarbonize that works as well as some other things we've seen?
Super interesting. Okay, so both of you have mentioned AI. I thought it was interesting that tech and AI were in fact a theme on the action agenda this year, given their potential to accelerate climate solutions. As Mekla said, AI is also, of course, incredibly power intensive, right? A massive driver of energy demand. So how did that play? Was climate tech really center stage? And if yes, are you seeing climate tech investments actually translating into real world impact? Sanjay, let's stay with you on that one.
Yeah, sure. Lucia, first, let me maybe just hit the AI point quickly. This will be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next year or two, because in some developed economies, you have a real choice to make. So can the hyperscalers who are driving these AI investments, can they find a way to do it using low carbon power, or does it need to be done using fossil-based power? And there are technologies that work for both, but the fossil ones are obviously, right, more proven. But the low carbon ones exist today. We have the technology that we need but we need it to go from smaller scale or pilot to like 100x. And we have examples of how it has happened in the past. So we've done it with renewables, we've done it with batteries, and we've done it with EVs. But as we go through those examples, it's also apparent that that hasn't been consistent. So in some geographies, some specific companies have been able to drive the scale up of those technologies very well, particularly in EVs and batteries. They've been able to come down the cost curve and build these mega factories. But for the most part, that hasn't been something that we've learned how to do globally. And I think it begs the question of, why is that? My view and what we see so far is that it's probably due to a traditional big project mentality and thinking. versus taking the operating model as a whole and changing it. And those who have been successful, some geographies, some specific companies that have been successful have done it that way. They've said, okay, we've got customer demand. We know what that customer demand is. Let's figure out how to get financing based on customer commitments. And then let's have our R&D team work with those really closely with our supply chain team to build a new supply chain, because that's often what it takes. And then that's going to go into the project build and the operating team. And we're all going to work together with our vendors, with our partners, with our customers to drive this with wholesale changes. It's not going to be, we hand this off to the projects team and they build something that's 100 times the size at half the cost. That approach hasn't worked. But what has worked is this overall operating model change.
Super interesting. Okay. Mikala, let's bring you back in. Same question we asked Sanjay. You will have had a plethora of discussions on the ground at COP. What resonated most with you?
Yeah, as you said at the beginning, Lucia, this was not my first COP. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the focus at this year's COP, not just on decarbonization, but the recognition that decarbonization or mitigation needs to go hand in hand with adaptation. And there were so many more dialogues that we had across the board, both in Sao Paulo and Belém, with organizations that are thinking about adaptation. And I think that's happening for two reasons. One is that there is a growing recognition that even as we undertake mitigation activity, there are real climate risks that already exist today, and places across the world are not adapted even to today's climate conditions. A second reason is that if you think about all the progress that we've made, all the forward momentum that we've talked about, it's helped mean that we're not on a path to 4 degrees Celsius of warming or 3.5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. But we are on a path, if we look across the range of expectations on our current trajectory of emissions, we are on a path to get to about 1.5 C on our current trajectory of emissions by about 2030 and 2 C by about 2050. And so what that means, if you think about adaptation projects that take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to get off the ground, we need to start planning for that today and anticipating that future today. And that's just prudency and good strategy. That means we start to anticipate and plan for that with that time horizon in mind. And so for both these reasons, the fact that there are risks today that we're not adapted to, and there is at least a path where those risks grow in the future, we need to start preparing and anticipating for that today. So I think there's growing recognition across sectors, whether that's the real economy or financial institutions, of that reality. I think the other part of this that I was very, I guess, happy to see is that as companies are approaching this conversation about adaptation, they are approaching it with real sophistication, in the sense that they're asking themselves questions. The leading companies, at least, are asking themselves questions about adaptation when it comes to their direct operations. So within their four walls, are their facilities resilient to flooding? How do their facilities perform if there's an extreme heat wave? But they're also asking that question of their supply chains, of their distribution channels, of how they show up for their consumers and customers and communities if risks manifest. So the leading companies are really thinking about managing their exposure to risks and doing that both in their direct operations and more broadly. The leading companies are also asking themselves where there are opportunities for them to provide the products and services to support the resilience needs of others, whether that's conversations I had with cooling companies that are thinking about more efficient, low emissions air conditioning units, to AI software companies that are thinking about better climate and weather data that can help support resilience and disaster recovery. So it's not just about risks, but it's also about how to think about the role that companies can play in providing the products, the services to support resilience more broadly. And then finally, I think the other part that I was quite heartened to see is that often when one thinks about climate risks and adaptation, if you close your eyes and imagine climate risks, the picture that comes into your mind is going to be a storm and a lot of rain and a lot of wind. And that's true that climate risks do mean that. But climate risks are actually broader than that. And one area that I think a lot of people are now starting to pay more attention to, and that's a good thing, is the question of heat. Because what we find with our research, and we're actually going to be launching a big report on adaptation next week, so watch out for that. But what we find with our research is that heat as a pervasive issue affecting a large number of people in large swaths of area is a very real risk. There are many solutions to manage heat impacts on human beings, on agriculture and supply chains, on physical infrastructure. But that as a topic will affect a large number of people, affect a large number of places, and we need to start talking about how we manage heat. And I did feel at COP this year that was much more a part of the dialogue on adaptation. It wasn't just about flooding and storms.
Okay. And folks can visit mckinsey.com to access the research that Mekla just referred to next week. Let's talk now about next steps. Again, we're 10 years out from the Paris Agreement. We've been talking about the need for and really the exigency of progress on climate and the energy transition for a while at this juncture. Mekla, you mentioned that there's recognition and sophistication and thinking about solutions now, but of course it's one thing to talk about what needs to be done and another thing actually to do it. What does all this mean for companies heading into 2026? And what should leaders realistically be doing to position themselves now for the future? And on this one, I'd love to hear from both of you. Sanjay, let's start with you, and then Mekla, Sanjay can pass the baton.
Yeah, happy to do that, Lucia. I mean, I think what you and Mekla both just highlighted was that companies are acting, they are moving, they've got different reasons for doing this. They've got reasons that fit within their own strategic goals. And I think that's a really important point to acknowledge this subtle but important shift for the different motivations on why people, companies, institutions, governments are making changes and driving sustainability. There used to be, if you look back to the recent past, that sustainability was largely about a moral imperative. It was the right thing to do. We were all focused on keeping it to a 1.5 degrees Celsius change. And what Mekla just walked us through is we're on a path to get there, if we're not there already by 2030. So that footing is a little bit less stable than it was before. And so there was this feeling like you're either on the team or you're not. Okay, so you're either doing it for those reasons, the moral imperative, or you're not on the team and you're doing it for other reasons. And now the shift is that we realize that there are multiple whys, okay, multiple reasons for why people might drive decarbonization. And you know what, that's fine. I think people are realizing that's fine. It all works. It's a step in the right direction. And frankly, it's a lot more durable to build this into an existing business strategy than it is to come up with a new one that's force fit into the moral imperative, which not everyone is on board with, or they have different reasons to do it. So the different reasons are like some countries, regions, people need more energy. They need more energy to industrialize, to enjoy the fruits of modernization. They need more reliability in their energy. They need better affordability. They need to fuel AI growth. They need to fuel industrial growth. They need to remain industrially competitive as a region or as a country. And all of those things are other reasons that you could use to drive sustainability. And that's what we're seeing take hold. So I think it's just worth mentioning one more time that we've moved from one why, which was a moral imperative. That still exists. It's still important. But we've got other people who have been co-opted into doing sustainability for other reasons. They might be economic, they might be something else, but that is all a step in the right direction. And what we saw at COP was people embracing that and just moving forward, saying, okay, let's just get on with it. Mekla, I'd love to hear, I don't know if you saw the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think this is echoed in what we describe here as being shifting from defense to offense, right? I think 2025 maybe felt for a lot of people like everything everywhere all at once. There was just so much changing in the world, so much being thrown at a CEO, a chief strategy officer, a CFO, a chief risk officer, just so many things happening in the world and so much to deal with. And I think companies maybe had a sense of being on the back foot or being on the defensive on a whole range of agendas, not just on sustainability. But I think as we look ahead to 2026, there's an opportunity for companies to shift from being on the defensive side to thinking about offense. Now, there does not need to be offense on every front, in every region, with every technology, with every agenda. But there is an opportunity in this moment. If a colleague of mine often uses this phrase, don't waste a good crisis, but there is an opportunity in this moment to say, what are the areas that are in the money today, that are viable opportunities today, that are aligned with our business today, and how do we execute relentlessly along the lines of what Sanjay described with the operating model earlier? How do we execute that on that seamlessly, flawlessly today? And where are there opportunities to make longer term strategic bets that are aligned with the core business competencies that an organization has? Remember, sustainability is a long game. We're talking about investing in long term assets that have 30-year lives in many instances, that come with a long lead time to think about innovation and execution around. So, how do we think about both the seamless execution on the things that work today? And then where do we want to make strategic bets that are aligned with longer term capabilities and competencies for the future? I think 2026 is a moment for companies to ask themselves that question and move away from this defensive posture to think about, let me call it strategic offensive posture versus across the board offensive posture. And then I think as they do that, we've alluded throughout this conversation about the need for nuance, meaning the way this is playing out across regions, the way this is playing out, this meaning the sustainability agenda is playing out across regions, across technologies, across sectors, across different motivations and the multiple whys that Sanjay alluded to. All of that requires nuance. It requires the ability to move beyond the headlines and actually understand what's going on the ground. And we think it's really important for companies to build that competency to really ask themselves sophisticated, nuanced questions about this agenda and understand those on the ground realities with care. And based on that, think about navigating the way forward.
Super interesting. Thank you, Mekla. I am mindful of time. Let's try to squeeze in at least one question from our audience. We've had quite a few. Based on what you saw at COP30 and maybe also from your client work here, what separates those organizations that are moving from commitments to credible delivery? Sanjay, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's a fit with, Lucia, the long-term business strategy here. Something that's going to survive business cycles, going to survive political cycles. It's if there is a way to drive resilience and economics and long-term competitive advantage and get the financing for it today, those things are moving right away.
Interesting. Okay. And let's get one more in. Mekla, anything more to say on AI and its impact on climate and sustainability solutions? We talked a lot about demand, but on the solution side of it.
Maybe just one thing on demand, and then I will answer the solution side, just because I think it's fascinating that, in the near term, there's a lot of concern about demand for energy from data centers and what that's going to do to emissions. But one way to think about this is that problems we were going to have to grapple with anyway down the road in a world where we're electrifying end uses like mobility or buildings, problems we were going to have to deal with anyway down the road. How do we integrate multiple sources of power into a grid? How do we scale up build out of transmission and distribution infrastructure? How do we manage sources like solar and wind that don't work all the time? How do we manage not just the supply side, but also demand side flexibility and other solutions? These are all things we would have had to deal with in any case as part of a successful energy transition. And in many ways, we're now dealing with that today because of this near-term demand for energy from data centers. And I think that's a good thing. Just to put a number on that, any estimates vary, but a lot of estimates would suggest that power demand from data centers in the US by 2030 will be something like 10% of overall electricity generation. If you think about a successful energy transition by 2050 in the US, we're talking about something like a 200% increase in power demand as we electrify end users, right? So just the scale of what we're trying to accomplish versus what data centers are doing today, it's vastly different. And so I think it's a good thing that we're dealing with these challenges and issues today, and we're forced to deal with these challenges and issues today.
Mm-hmm.
On the supply side, as you said, AI also does have the potential. It's not going to be a silver bullet, of course, but it does have the potential to help in advancing the sustainability agenda. And we're seeing many examples of that already. We're seeing companies that are thinking about better climate and weather modeling, as I said, and the use of AI towards that. We're seeing the use of AI in the design of new materials, the design of new equipment that can be more efficient, that can produce material properties that we didn't otherwise have access to. We're seeing the use of AI in actually the discovery of critical minerals and using it for geological surveys and things of that sort. So there's many, many different applications. If you think about what we need to do to decarbonize, we need to decarbonize power and mobility and buildings and industry. And across each of these sectors, you see example after example of the role of AI in helping support the sustainability agenda. We're still at early days of that, but I think there is a lot of promise and a lot of opportunity for what AI can help us unlock.
Really fascinating. Okay, that brings us to time. It was a fantastic discussion. Sanjay and Mekhala, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. It was great to be here. Thank you.
And as always, many thanks to all of you in our McKinsey Live audience today. You will be able to find a replay of this conversation and all our previous McKinsey Live events at mckinsey.com/live. We are fitting in one more event between now and the end of the year. Please join us in a couple of weeks on December 16th. As we gear up for CES in January. We are talking about some very cool topics at this event, including autonomous vehicles and the future of robotics. And you can register now by scanning the QR code that's on screen. See you there in a couple of weeks' time. And until then, be well.